In the 1980s, I had a beautiful Apple II clone called the ATEX 2000, and so this is my history of computers part 2. Welcome to Billboard. For those familiar with my channel, you'll know that my first computer was the legendary Dick Smith Wizard. But after the Wizard, I moved on to some hardcore computing. I went the full Apple II clone with a machine called the ATEX 2000. I bought my ATEX 2000 from a place called Universal Office Machines in Newcastle, Australia, and I worked there subsequently on and off for a few years. It was a fun place to work and an awesome start to a career in IT. Anyway, like many of the Apple II clones, or compatibles as they were referred to at the time, the ATEX 2000 had some unique features that differentiated it from the Apple II. The main differentiator was the keyboard. Unlike the Apple II, the ATEX 2000 had a separate keyboard, a bit like the IBM machines at the time. In that respect, to me it felt more like a business computer, which was an awesome thing, particularly since I was a kid. I basically bought my ATEX 2000 with my life savings, thanks Mum for all that pocket money, and I had a choice between a new computer or being billeted with a family in New York. My friend chose the latter, and one of his favourite memories was going to the top of the World Trade Center towers. I remember thinking, yep, plenty of time to do that later in life. Anyway, I had a shiny new ATEX 2000 and all the perks associated with it. Being a business computer, my ATEX 2000 was Z80 compatible, and therefore I had access to CP/M, something I'd never heard of before. My machine even came with a copy of WordStar and DBase 2. I actually mastered WordStar, which meant I was probably one of only a few kids that could use a word processor at the time when many businesses in the world were still using typewriters. DBase 2 I found a little bit more challenging, and I didn't really get the beauty of databases until I was introduced to the wonderful Microsoft Access many years later. Why do people hate Access so much? I think the first piece of software I went out and purchased was Flight Simulator 2, which was just fantastic. After finally mastering takeoff and landings, I always fantasized that one day I might be on a real flight and somebody will ask, "Does anyone know how to fly a plane?" The next piece of software I purchased was Castle Wolfenstein, and it was during that game that I had my first terrifying game-related jump scare. I was completely immersed in the game and had been playing for a while when I walked into a room and into an SS officer. He loudly said something in German and I literally leapt off my chair. Of course, it was only a matter of time before I wanted to accessorize, and my friend had this really cool speech synthesizer called Sam, the software automatic mouth.
Hello, my name is Sam.
This thing was awesome, and it turned out that a local computer shop called Microeducational had a version of Sam called RAM, the remote automatic mouth. It was nearly identical. In fact, it may have been a complete blatant rip-off, but it was super fun all the same. On a side note, Microeducational had their own branded floppy disks that were quite cheap, and if you see ads for old Apple II disks in Australia, you're almost guaranteed to see Microeducational disks. It was at Microeducational that I bought myself a gorgeous little joystick and ended up almost destroying my computer in an attempt to give it the option of auto fire. They say a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, and it certainly was for me. I hypothesised that if I connected a 9-volt battery to a small electric motor and then connected the wires across my fire button, it might simulate auto fire. At the time I couldn't see any issues with connecting a 9-volt battery that would link back to a motherboard with sensitive semiconductors. Well, turns out it was a bad thing to do. I heard a crackle, a pop and a lovely little spark flash, and my computer instantly shut down and smelt like burning. After that, only one of my fire buttons on the joystick ever worked again, even after testing with a different joystick. I'm probably lucky the computer continued to work at all, but it did. Phew! So back to the software. There was this really cool piece of software back in the day called PrintShop, which introduced us to the wonderful world of desktop publishing. PrintShop allowed you to make all kinds of posters, greeting cards, banners, so you could imagine everyone in my family that year got their custom birthday cards printed on a dot matrix printer. At some stage, my mind turned to creating backup copies of my friends' games. I started learning about some of the more wonderful utilities like Copy2 Plus and Locksmith. Between these two pieces of software, you were able to make backup copies of almost any Apple II software. You would even get to understand how the different noises that your disk drive was making during the copy process could mean the difference between a successful copy or an unsuccessful one. It was like being a disk whisperer. Shh. Of course, I loved the amazing games that were available for the Apple II. I loved Swashbuckler, Karateka, Lode Runner, Ultima 2, Taipan, and Sabotage. As was typical at the time, I ended up with possibly hundreds of floppy disks with games and utilities on them. In fact, whenever I see an ad for Apple II software on eBay in Australia, I always scrutinise the handwriting on the floppy disk to see if they are one of my old disks. Although it turns out my handwriting looks a lot like every other nerd from the early 80s. And then later in the 80s, as often happens in the tech world, I moved on to other computer interests and I sold my ATEX 2000. I think it might have been via a classified ad in the paper. Remember those? Fast forward to 30-something years later, and I suddenly had the overpowering yearning to have an Apple II machine once more. And I happened upon an Apple IIc, which I got at a reasonable price, and it's a little beauty. In fact, when the Apple IIc originally came out, I used to dream of owning one, and now I do. But I still yearn for an ATEX 2000. I've never seen anyone else mention one online, and the only reference I could find was this scan of an advertisement on a website that attempts to list all the Apple II clones. I have no idea if there is a surviving ATEX 2000 out there in the wild, and it would be fantastic to know there was at least one. Have you ever heard of one of these? Please let me know in the comments. And that concludes part 2 of my history of computers. If you liked what you saw, please feel free to subscribe, as I have an entire brain full of vintage tech to talk about. Thanks for watching.
Round.